All right, so this paper draft, actually it's a draft, so I am really interested in people's comments, is supposed to go to an upcoming Synthèse issue on representations in neuroscience. And I was interested in exploring the usefulness of this new, relatively new technique called representational similarity analysis as applied to neuroimaging for elucidating the nature of neural and mental representations. Hang on a second. Okay, there we go. Part of my interest in this is that I've been concerned by, and also I think moved by, some of the concerns that certain psychologists and philosophers have had about the usefulness of neuroimaging. And in particular, there are some people who think that neuroimaging is a complete waste of time if what you're interested in is psychology. So for instance, Max Coltheart has made the argument that in principle, neuroimaging can't answer any psychological questions. I think that he's actually, although there's been a lot of pushback, I think he's doubled down on that recently. And it's been interesting to me that this is a reaction that some psychologists have to imaging, but not other kinds of neural information. So psychologists in general were pretty interested with in the results from single cell recordings, the work of Hubel and Wiesel to start things off, but much more stuff that's been going on recently as a way of trying to translate psychological concepts into their realization base in neuroscience. Oh, interesting. Why is that not working? Oh, I see. Okay. And in philosophy, Fodor has been noteworthy in bashing neuroimaging as well. So in a pretty entertaining article in the London Review of Books, Fodor said, it bears emphasis that there are lots of things other than looking for functional loci that brain scientists do for a living, and that they use lots of experimental techniques other than neural imaging to do them. But it's functional localization by neural imaging for which the Times is especially enthusiastic. So he's criticizing the Times here for their coverage of imaging. And I'd guess that as the time goes, so go the grants, which in fact I think was the way it was for quite some time. It particularly likes these polychrome maps that show a place in the brain that's red when you're thinking about one thing and green when you're thinking about something else. And he says, well, to come to the point, I wonder why the Times cares. I wonder why anybody cares. And he just doesn't think that imaging can tell us anything interesting about the nature of psychology. So this question of whether imaging can help us study neural and mental representation, I think, is a good question. Part of the answer to the question, I think, comes from thinking about what the methodological advances have brought to neuroimaging. So many of these criticisms were first levied early on in the era of imaging, where people really relied primarily on univariate analyses. So they would look at changes in imaging signal, which usually correlates with blood flow, across two different tasks, and then try to attribute the differences in the tasks to the differences in the blood flow signal, and localize certain functions to certain parts of the brain by virtue of these changes in signal. And that really was the way that PET was primarily positron emission tomography, which was the first real functional neuroimaging method. That was the basic method, a subtraction method by which PET worked. And then when functional MRI was developed, it essentially co-opted the same methods as PET, even though it had been much better in terms of temporal and spatial resolution than PET was. But the early fMRI experiments basically used PET methods. And as time has gone on, neuroimaging has switched largely from these univariate analyses to multivariate analyses that look for patterns of signal change across areas of cortex in analyzing the differences between different kinds of psychological tasks. And I think an interesting way of thinking about it was put by Kriegeskort and Bandettini, which was that early on, the focus was on activation, just what places were active during a task, whereas these new techniques give you a handle on the information that is being processed by a task. Okay, so what I want to do today is think about the way in which representational similarity analysis can or cannot tell us something about neural representation. So I'll start with briefly explaining fMRI for anyone who isn't familiar with the technique. Then I'll give a brief presentation of what representational similarity analysis does. Then I'll talk about more philosophical questions about what representation is or entails and what sorts of things we should be thinking about and looking for. And then trying to combine these things, look at what RSA tells us about representation and what it doesn't tell us, and then revisit this question of whether neuroimaging matters to psychology. So functional MRI. I'm assuming that most people are familiar with at least the basic idea of functional MRI, but if you stick somebody into an MR magnet and use particular kinds of pulse sequences that essentially subjects their brain to changing magnetic fields and radio frequency pulses, the kinds of signal that the MR scanner can pick up tells you something about properties of aggregates of molecules in a region of tissue. These regions are called voxels. They're essentially three-dimensional pixels, so bits of brain tissue that encompass many, many millions of neurons. But what you're looking at is some correlate of the activity of these populations of neurons in the voxels. So the bold signal, which stands for blood oxygenation level dependent signal, looks at the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood. And there are lots of independent studies that suggest that that ratio is indicative roughly with blood flow. And then there are other kinds of studies from early years of PET that showed that neural activation is also correlated with blood flow. And so you can make inferences of what the activation levels are in voxels of brain tissue by looking at these bold signals. Now, functional MRI is a wonderful technique because it allows us essentially for the first time to look at activity in normal, awake, behaving human beings without any kind of invasive measures. But it's also a limited technique in that it's both spatially and temporally limited. So there's a lower level of resolution spatially in functional MRI that's very, I mean, you can get better resolution than 3 millimeter cubic voxels, but at a cost and by also using much stronger magnets than most people have accessible. And there are also some concerns about the safety of the very strong magnets. So most fMRI studies are at more or less a resolution of 3 cubic millimeters. And that size voxel encompasses, as I said, millions of neurons, and those neurons don't necessarily all do the same thing in different tasks. And so you might have redundancy in which the very same signal in a voxel could result from very different kinds of activations, very different low-level computations going on in that very same region of tissue. But the fact is, and we have lots of evidence for this, that there are systematic structure function mappings in the brain And so even if there's not a one-to-one mapping between activity levels and computations in the brain, you can still make inferences about function, given that there are these systematic structure function mappings. Okay, so there are limitations in spatial resolution, but not limitations that are so bad as to obviate any usefulness of this kind of technique. And there are also limitations in temporal resolution, because the bold signal is a signal that reflects blood flow, and blood flow is kind of a low-pass filter of neural activity. So it's delayed in time, it's spread out in time, and so you lose a lot of temporal information in this as well. Okay. So as I said, there's been quite a bit of improvement in terms of fMRI methods. And so the early univariate analyses have been largely displaced by multivariate analyses that look at patterns of activity rather than regions of change between different cognitive tasks. And in particular, machine learning methods have been co-opted to try to both understand the patterns and help in predicting and classifying different patterns that are seen in different cognitive tasks. And so what's called multi-voxel pattern analysis, or MVPA, can tell you, for instance, whether different patterns of activity in different conditions are linearly separable and therefore discriminable. And it has been suggested anyway that if you get linear separability, then that's an indication that the brain itself, using the kinds of population readout codes that we think are operative, can read out the information in, let's say, one area by a downstream area, because these kinds of methods, these kinds of readout mechanisms are also able to look at linear separability. So it's an indication that the information is explicitly represented in the sense that the brain could use this information, but it's not an indication that it necessarily does use that information. So here is just a very quick illustration of how multi-voxel pattern analysis works. So what you would do, this is an early study, perhaps really the first study published using these kinds of methods. They showed subjects different categories of visual stimuli, so faces, houses, chairs, and shoes. And what you can see by looking at the patterns of brain activity that are reflected or that are caused by viewing these different kinds of stimuli is that in the very same regions of tissue, you get activation for all of these classes of stimuli. So it's not like there's a face hair area and a house area that's distinct, and then a distinct chair area, et cetera. But you get overlapping activity in the very same regions of brain tissue, but the patterns that occur for each of these classes of objects differ slightly. And so you can think of these as sort of a signature of the class of objects. And if you feed that information into a classifier and train it on these kinds of different categories of objects, or the data from these different categories of objects, then you could do something like give it a new pattern where you don't know what it is that the person is looking at, and decode the object that they are seeing by its similarity to the patterns it's been trained upon. Okay, so this decoding has been a very important method in neuroscience and neuroimaging now. And we've been able to show that there's information sufficient for decoding many kinds of things in many parts of cortex. But nonetheless, there have been limitations pointed out for multivoxel pattern analysis. One of the main ones is that even though you can see that there are differences in brain activity for different kinds of stimuli, you don't know that what you're seeing has causal efficacy, that the brain is actually relying on the information that is showing up in these neuroimaging experiments. So what you get is information. You can prove that there is information available, but you can't prove that it's actually being used. So there are other things that you have to do in order to demonstrate causality, which is essentially intervene in the brain in some way. That is not something that neuroimaging typically does, although it can be combined with kinds of interventions like TMS. Moreover, just the fact that you are able to classify information doesn't prove or doesn't indicate what aspect of the data allows for classification. It just suggests that information is present, but it doesn't tell you what the information is that it's using. And it doesn't tell you even that the information that it's using is going to be information that the experimenter thinks is being probed for the experiment. So, for instance, you might have something about a background in a task that is common, that correlates with the object. Let's say this is a visual recognition task. If you have aspects of the background that happen to correlate with the class of object, it's possible that what you're picking up on is the background and not the object. And then a further thing is that multivoxel pattern analysis is spatially ambiguous. So different kinds of cortical patterns in different areas can give rise to the very same ultimate performance, that is success in classification. And successful classification also doesn't tell you what information in the that you're feeding into the classifier is being used in order to result in that classification. So these are problems in interpreting the usefulness or interpreting why MVPA works or what it is in the brain, drawing a link between the results of MVPA and psychological things of interest, like how the brain is actually doing things. But a more recently used technique, which has been adapted from originally, I think, psychology, is representational similarity analysis. And this relies on the idea of a representational geometry. So think about a representational space, which can be defined in terms of a similarity metric that characterizes a data set, where the distance given that metric tells you how similar things in that space are. So then the set of relationships across that data set describes a representational geometry, or the geometry of that similarity space. And a way of a familiar way of thinking about it is to think about the color space, where there's a way of characterizing that color space so that close relationships in that space correspond to similarity judgments in our perceptual space. And there are also other kinds of ways of showing a color representational geometry. It could depend on whether you're using RGB coding or CMYK coding or other things. So there are different ways of characterizing that representational geometry, but the idea is that distances in that similarity space are captured by this representational geometry. And so this is what representational similarity analysis uses. And so I'll give you a very brief characterization of RSA. So it's one of a series of model-based fMRI analysis techniques. And it is a way of calculating the similarity between different representational geometries. So essentially what you're looking at is the similarity between the representational geometry that the brain uses and a representational geometry of a model. And the model can be drawn from different things, as I'll show you. And so it differs from MVPA because it's not worried about classification, it's worried about characterizing a representational geometry. So essentially what you do in RSA is you take different patterns of brain activity. So you're looking at, let's say, series of voxels and activation values, and you encode those as vectors. And then you can use a distance metric to look at the distance between pairs of vectors. And you do this across, let's say, a series of stimuli, and you can look then at the differences in the distances across different pairs of stimuli and construct a diagonalized matrix of pairwise comparisons by doing this. And this is called the representational dissimilarity matrix, or RDM, of that task. And the distances, or the differences, the entries in this matrix, are scalar quantities, and so they are format neutral and abstractions from the measurements themselves. And then what you can do is compare these matrices to each other. So this is a kind of second order comparison. And it's this that allows you to make comparisons between activity in brains and other kinds of things. They could be also activities in brains, or they could also be weights in computational models, or they could be behavioral profiles or something like that. So here's just a way of visually thinking about it. So I don't know whether people can see my arrow. And I also don't know if you can answer. So I'm going to just use my arrow and hopefully you can see it. So here you can think of these being two different stimuli that you're presenting to somebody, and you're looking at a pattern of activity in a chunk of brain. So this is activity levels in a pattern of voxels, and these are translated into vectors, and the distance between these vectors is calculated, and it's the scalar value, and it populates this square of a matrix. So you see that here are the two entries that have contributed to this difference measure. And you do that for all of the stimuli that have been presented. And you'll see it's diagonalized because you're getting identity across the things that are the same. And then what you can do is compare this matrix to matrices that are, let's say, derived from people's judgments of similarity in behavior, or different computational model representations for the same stimuli, or other kinds of measures of similarity or dissimilarity. So this is the model that you're comparing the brain activation to. And that's essentially what RSA is. It allows you to represent the similarity space of one set of data in a form that allows you to compare it to another set of data. So it abstracts from the format of the representations of themselves, and also other things that are associated with this format, so absolute magnitude, location, etc. So you can compare representations across individuals who may have somewhat different representational spaces. You can compare across species. You can compare between behavior and parts of the brain. You can compare between computational models and parts of the brain, etc. And so I think this is what gives it a lot of flexibility. So this is just a list of the ways in which people can and have used RSA. So here you have a human fMRI, and you might compare one human to another. You might compare one region to another region. You might compare a human to a monkey. You could even compare across methods. So you can look at cell recordings, single cell recordings from monkey, and compare it to fMRI data. You can do other modalities, and you can even develop models and compare it to that to see how well your model actually fits the data of neural activation in particular regions. Okay, so that is RSA. And then there's a question. I mean, representational similarity analysis has the word representation in it, but I think that that is sort of a technical term in mathematics rather than a philosophical term about psychology. And so the question is how representational is the result in RSA for somebody who's interested in representations in the brain or mind. So in this third part, I'll just briefly talk about philosophical ideas about representation, and it's of course a huge literature, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into it, but I'm going to make the assumption that that computationalism is the most likely or productive way of thinking about neural and mental representations, where computationalism takes cognition to be some kind of computation, where computations are operations over representations. So a computational explanation necessarily makes reference to representations. And to have a complete computational explanation, you would want an account of those representations, like what those representations are, including both their structure and their content, what Frankie Egan calls the interpretation function. And you also want some account of how those things are physically realized in the causal processes that operate on those representations, which she calls the realization function. And a computational explanation has certain kinds of commitments, at least classic computationalism. It's committed to the reality of representation. It's also committed to a distinction between vehicle and content. And so the sort of magic trick of computationalism is that you can explain reason-respecting behavior or semantic behavior in purely physical terms, because in some sense the semantics is paralleled by the physical realization, and causal processes operating on the physical realization therefore lead to semantic transformations. And so there needs to be some distinction between vehicle and content, where you can talk about operations on vehicles that lead to parallel changes in content. And then there have been other desiderata that have been elucidated more than I speak about here, but the main ones I think are that there's a systematicity to these kinds of computational systems. So representations have to be part of a system of representation that has a function for the organism. And that entails that those representations have to be used by the system itself. They have to be used, consumed, or interpreted. And they also have to play a role in explaining intelligent behavior. Other ones that I think are, well, one that's not a problem for this kind of approach, at least applied to things like neural activity, is to have naturalizable content. So, we want to have a naturalistic account of semantic content. And another thing that Fodor actually put a lot of weight on is any account of representation has to give you a plausible account also of misrepresentation. Now, there's a lot to say about content itself. I don't think that we necessarily have to make any decisions about philosophical theories of content in order to make the assumption that brain activity carries content. There's been notable difficulty in coming up with a theory of content that will cover all cases of representation, but there are different kinds of stories of content, from like causal theories to teleosemantic theories, etc. And at least in terms of perceptual content, there's a plausible causal story where, coming into contact with things in the world is what triggers certain kinds of at least low-level representations with content that can be further elucidated in the cortical hierarchy. So there's been, I think, advances in the way in which people have thought about representation in the brain, also largely motivated by advances in computational theory, where you can think of brain states as representing high-dimensional state spaces. And some of the dimensions can be easily mapped onto the cortex. So if you look at certain parts of cortex, you can see that there are dimensions of content that are just represented in the spatial topography. So if you look at motor and somatosensory cortex, for instance, there's kind of a homunculus spatially represented across those parts of cortex. And then there are other kinds of content that seem to be iterated in substructures across the cortex. And then presumably, especially in higher areas, content that's encoded much more sparsely and functionally than the things that we can anatomically distinguish. And we also know from lots of neuroscientific work that there's a hierarchy of representation in the cortex where primary sensory areas have pretty low-level properties, and that there are increasingly complex properties built out of those as you go up the cortical hierarchy. All of this, of course, is complicated by feedback and perhaps predictive coding kinds of principles. So this is kind of a heuristic, but not the whole story. But one thing that you can see is that content gets increasingly elaborated. So if you look at, now this is an RDM, a matrix of how similar and dissimilar brain activity in different areas of cortex is to across a whole range of stimuli. If you look at early visual cortex on the right, you see that there's a lot of basically similarity in category structure is not reflected by similarity in activity. So there's not a lot of structure in this rightward RDM. You can't, just by looking at activity, classify, for instance, animate from inanimate. And this is the kind of thing that you would expect, because the visual properties of the low-level visual properties of objects are very variable and not necessarily correlated with category structure. But then if you look higher in cortex, for instance, at inferotemporal cortex, you'll see that there's much more structure here, where the inanimate stuff seems to be clustered together, and the animate stuff is clustered together. And in particular, then there are clusters where you look at faces that are much more clustered together, or much more similar to each other. So it shows that there's sort of an increase in categorization as you move from the lower to high level cortex. And so one way you can think of the problem of understanding representation is to try to understand the structure of a semantic space, and to see whether you can map that semantic space into the activity, the representational geometry of activity in a cortical space. And so when you do that with fMRI, you of course are looking at something that has low spatial resolution. It's going to give you a pretty blurred map of what that space is. But nonetheless, you might be able, depending on what the geometry of the semantic space is, to also see that those things are related. And I think that's one way of trying to understand representation in the brain, is to see how semantic spaces are related to neural representational spaces. Okay, so is RSA a good method for trying to do that? So one thing you could ask is, are we getting at representations at all? And as I mentioned before, at least a computational view suggests that there has to be a vehicle content distinction, and that's something that you might expect to see. And the vehicles that you would be seeing in fMRI and RSA using fMRI are voxels, and that is not a real biological vehicle for content, because that's not what the brain uses, right? So the brain is using neurons, and there are millions of neurons in a single voxel. The voxels themselves have no causal power. And so, of course, if the voxels have no causal power, they can't also be used by the brain to do anything. So it doesn't give you function as either. So what I like to think of this as doing is giving us proxy vehicles. So they're not the true vehicles of content, but they are nonetheless based upon or dependent upon what we presume the true vehicles of content are, which are neurons or populations of neurons. And I think that you can infer representational contents from proxy vehicles with the understanding that the true vehicles that do have causal powers are essentially a subset of these proxy vehicles. And you can get then provisional content ascriptions when you see that comparisons of activation values from RSA or from fMRI, when you do RSA, compare favorably with content from whatever the other model is that you're using, where you presumably have an understanding of what the structure of that space is. So one way to just illustrate that is looking at these studies that look at relationships between monkey and human inferotemporal cortex. And so in this study, Rusbe-Kiani looked at the ways in which single cells in monkey cortex respond to a variety of stimuli, visual stimuli, and classified those according to their similarity amongst each other in terms of individual cellular firing patterns. And he got a similarity matrix like the one on the left. Okay, so that is derived from single cell recording in monkeys. And then a neural, using the very same stimuli given to humans in a functional imaging experiment, doing also the building an RDM, what you see is that they're very, very similar in terms of the structure, even though you're going across species and you're going across methods. And so that suggests that the organization of the cortical space and that the activations in that cortical space in humans somehow parallels the low-level functional organization in monkeys. Or that, I mean, we assume that the monkey, that the reason we're seeing the parallel in these two cases is that the underlying neural activity in the human is analogous to the activity we're seeing in the monkey, and that even with the blurring that fMRI gives you, that structure is still able to come through. In addition, you could, so that's a way of looking at representation and the kinds of relationships between different representations. But in addition, you might be able to make inferences about transformation. So if you look at where invariances in the RDM come from and see where in cortical hierarchies these invariances arise, you can make inferences about what is being computed or extracted from the signal at these various stages. And so, although, as I said, functional MRI doesn't give you causal information, so it can't give you a proof that things have functional consequences. When those things are paralleled by behavior, you might have you do have a prima facie case, I think, for function. So I thought that I had a figure to illustrate that, but I don't. I think I might coming up later. So I think we do have both vehicle content distinctions plausibly, and we also have indications of functional importance. The other big category is, can we give an account of misrepresentation? And this has always been a challenge because misrepresentation requires that there is a norm for what is correct representation, and naturalistic accounts have had difficulty in giving accounts of norms. But I think that with things like representational geometry, you have at least the kind of stuff that you need in order to get access or make a plausible account for norms, because structure requires a coherence of a system, and the system has to maintain a certain kind of organization and certain kinds of transformations across different levels of hierarchies. The fact that you see the same kinds of representational geometries across people and across species may give us a way of handling misrepresentation. So, for instance, if you see deviations in individuals that are not replicated across everyone, you might be able to identify instances that are plausibly misrepresentations. So I think systematic deviations would just indicate that you don't have the right kind of representational description, but local deviations could indicate misrepresentation. And so one illustration of this is, for instance, that Connolly and colleagues showed that there's a gradient of predacity in IT, so that different animals that are more or less dangerous or predatory are represented in a gradient, so that the more dangerous ones are represented close to the more dangerous ones, and the less dangerous ones to the less dangerous ones in this gradient. And you might see in, for instance, in an individual, this is completely hypothetical, but suppose you gave them a mouse and you saw activation in the highly dangerous part, then you might be able to make an argument that that person is misrepresenting a mouse as highly dangerous. So I think that in the context of overall structure, you get some kind of foothold for explaining misrepresentation. All right, so to summarize what RSA can do for you, I think it suggests that we can infer representational contents from proxy vehicles. It suggests that the cortex encodes some semantic features in a map-like way, with the semantic relationships mirrored in similarities of patterned activity. It allows us to get some kind of grip on what computational transformations are within and across levels. And I think it suggests that, at least at the scale of fMRI, neural representation looks more analog than digital, because if it were digital, then there would not need to be any kind of high-level organization. Everything could just have its identity in virtue of the low-level non-proxy vehicle, but the actual vehicle. The fact that we're getting these gradients and structures across cortex, I think, suggests that contents are structured and represented systematically in analog kinds of ways. Okay, so that's what's good about RSA. What is missing? So one thing that's missing, of course, is indication that these kinds of representations are being consumed, that the content that we are attributing is actually content that plays a role in further processing. It, first of all, yields information about representation that doesn't tell us anything about the true nature of the vehicles of content, right? So we know it's not voxels because those aren't real entities. We assume that it's something having to do with the populations of neurons that are comprised in the voxel, but we don't know either what those populations are, how those computations are being carried out, and what the information is that they carry, other than the information that we are putting into our model. And secondly, this causal question, we don't know whether or even or how or even whether that information that we're looking at in RSA is being used by the brain, right? And if it's not being used by the brain, it's actually epiphenomenal to behavior. So it doesn't satisfy function. It's not a demonstration that function is satisfied. So therefore, I think these kinds of investigations give us a how possibly, but not a how actually story. Nonetheless, it's very good for generating hypotheses that can be tested with other kinds of techniques. So I've talked about what I think RSA can tell us and what it leaves out or doesn't tell us. And now I just want to circle back to the question that I started with, which is whether any of this matters to psychology. And I think that the best way to address this question is compared to what? And so what I want to do is think about other methods in cognitive psychology that usually rely on some simple behavioral measures like reaction times or eye movements, which have really formed the cornerstone of psychology, cognitive psychology, for quite a long time, and ask whether those things fare better on these kinds of criteria. And it seems to me that these things in general don't fare a lot better. They're slightly different. So I'm just going to think about Shepard and Metzler's sort of classic experiment where they gave people two kinds of projections of 3D objects and asked them to judge whether they were the same object rotated or mirror images of one another. And this was an extremely famous set of experiments. It made the cover of Science. And what they did is they asked subjects to judge whether the two-dimensional projections of these three-dimensional objects were the same or different, and to press a button as soon as they made their decision. So they were measuring reaction times, and they found that the reaction time scaled linearly with the angle of rotation, and that this timing was independent of whether they were just rotated in the plane or rotated in 3 dimensions. And so they posited on the basis of those results that people constructed 3D mental representations, which they rotated, and there was sort of a constant time of rotation, so that the greater the angle of rotation, the longer it would take the individual to do the mental rotation. And so this very influential set of results, I think psychologists took that to indicate the reality of these mental representations. But the Shepard experiment gives you no access to representational vehicle at all, right? So that the idea that there's a mental representation that we are sort of mentally manipulating and rotating in our minds is just inferred from the reaction time data. And that seems like it's even more removed from the real representation than the RSA data is using fMRI. Because at least the RSA points to a brain area as a plausible candidate for the existence of that vehicle, right? Whereas there was nothing in the Shepard experiment that told you anything about where you would find such a vehicle. The thing that made the Shepard experiment powerful is that these mental representations were causally implicated in the explanation of behavior. So what they got was trial by trial variability in reaction time, and inferred that the mental rotation of these constructed mental objects was the causal reason that you got the differences in reaction time on these individual trials. And to be clear, most uses of RSA don't really compare a neural representation directly to a behavioral measure. And this is not true across the board, of course. There's studies in which individual differences and similarity judgments are found to correlate with individual differences in representational geometry and stuff. So there is evidence that you can do a similar kind of shepherd-like experiment using RSA. Other ones at least make reference to behavioral capacities that are demonstrated by the subjects. But many of them just look at structural similarities across two things without any reference to individual behavior. So it's possible for RSA to be used in the way that the shepherd experiment has been, although it's often not used that way. And so I guess what I take away from this is that RSA itself has a lot to offer, and it can provide defeasible evidence for representations. Part of what I think people think is wrong with it is that it's not you can't directly infer causal efficacy from RSA demonstrations, but I think the more that you can link these representational geometries to each other, and specifically to behavioral measures, the more reason we have to think that there is actually causal efficacy to the geometries that we're seeing. But I think even in the absence of that kind of evidence, strong similarities between models, I think, is defeasibly evidence of representation. And in general, I think that if you're asking the question of whether this stuff should matter to psychology, then I think that these kinds of RSA experiments are at least on as good footing as Shepard's experiments were, and these have been taken to be a cornerstone of cognitive psychology. If you think that those things are psychologically interesting, then you should also think that model-based fMRI analyses are. More importantly, though, I think that RSA is really very powerful as a tool for discovery and hypothesis testing. So Egan, for instance, talks about the important role in cognitive science for using representational ascriptions in as a tool for discovery. And I think that RSA is exceptionally good at identifying candidate hypotheses and regions for more low-level concrete neuroscientific work that can also tell us something about perhaps their causal importance in a processing hierarchy. It also can provide us with behavior-related information that's really hard to get by other methods. So it's just not very often that you get to record from humans in, doing single-cell recordings in a way behaving humans. And so using these neuroimaging methods will give us access to things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to know. But I think that it's important when you're at least evaluating the importance of a technique to recognize that it's one of a series or an entire stable of different techniques, and it never stands alone. Neuroimaging you can't interpret neuroimaging without bringing in knowledge that has been gotten from other kinds of modalities. And so, while it's a very important tool, it's an important tool in the context of the other kinds of tools we have. It doesn't supplant the importance of those other tools. So I think that is all I have to say. And it's been fun, if it's surreal, speaking to you all. So I'll turn it over now